Imagine a world where your closest allies were your greatest enemies, where the men drinking martinis in your embassy's drawing room were quietly sending your nation's secrets straight to Moscow. During the Cold War, the CIA and MI6 believed they were the guardians of the free world, protecting democracy from communist tyranny. But what if the very foundation of that alliance was already compromised? What if, long before anyone suspected it, the Soviets had already won the most important battle, the battle for trust? This is the story of the Cambridge Five, Britain's most notorious spy ring, and the shocking American connection that changed the CIA forever. It all began in the 1930s at the University of Cambridge, a place of privilege, intellect, and rebellion. Europe was sliding toward fascism. Hitler was rising. To many young British students, communism looked like the only ideology strong enough to stop it. Among these students were 5 men who would one day become legends of betrayal: Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. They were charming, brilliant, and utterly convincing. They didn't look like spies. They looked like the future leaders of Britain. But as they debated politics in candle-lit dorm rooms, Soviet recruiters were listening, and soon the KGB had something priceless: 5 insiders planted in Britain's ruling class. When World War II broke out, the Cambridge Five joined Britain's intelligence and diplomatic services. Philby entered MI6. Maclean and Burgess joined the Foreign Office. Blunt was recruited into MI5, and Cairncross became a secret analyst in British intelligence. They didn't need to infiltrate the system. The system invited them in. But their rise wasn't just a British problem, because after 1945, the center of global power shifted across the Atlantic. The United States emerged as the dominant Western force, and the CIA, newly formed in 1947, leaned heavily on British intelligence for training, experience, and cooperation. That's where the Americans made their fatal mistake. The CIA trusted the British, and the British trusted the Cambridge Five. Through that fragile chain of faith, Soviet intelligence gained access to the heart of the American spy network, years before anyone even suspected the betrayal. No one embodied this deception better than Harold Kim Philby. He was brilliant, confident, and had the kind of charisma that made people lower their guard. By the late 1940s, Philby had become the liaison between MI6 and the CIA, the man responsible for sharing Britain's most sensitive intelligence with Washington. He drank with American officers, shared jokes with them, and even mentored some of the CIA's rising stars. They called him our British friend. What they didn't know was that every operation he touched was being leaked directly to Moscow. When the CIA and MI6 jointly launched missions to infiltrate Eastern Europe, Philby secretly provided the Soviets with the names of every agent involved. Entire teams disappeared behind the Iron Curtain, arrested, tortured, or killed because of one man sitting comfortably in an embassy in Washington. DC Philby's betrayal wasn't just operational, it was personal. He attended dinner parties with CIA legends like James Jesus Angleton, one of America's top counterintelligence chiefs. Angleton admired Philby, even loved him like a brother. And when the truth came out years later, that trust shattered Angleton's sanity and changed the entire philosophy of US counterintelligence. By the early 1950s, cracks began to show. The CIA couldn't understand why so many of its Eastern European operations failed. In 1951, 2 British diplomats, Burgess and Maclean, suddenly vanished. They had been living double lives, secretly passing US and British nuclear and diplomatic secrets to the Soviets. Their escape to Moscow exposed a horrifying truth. The Soviet Union had deep moles inside the Western Alliance. When Burgess and Maclean disappeared, fingers pointed toward Philby, but there was no solid proof. And his American friends defended him. Once again, charm and loyalty blinded the eyes of justice. Philby returned to London under quiet suspicion, but the CIA-MI6 partnership never recovered. Behind closed doors, Washington began to question every British cable, every piece of intelligence shared. The shadow of betrayal hung heavy. In 1955, British investigations finally exposed more evidence. Philby was confronted and dismissed, but instead of facing prison, he was quietly allowed to retire. The British government didn't want a scandal. To the CIA, it was a nightmare. If Britain couldn't even arrest its own traitors, how could the Americans trust them? Years later, in 1963, Kim Philby finally defected to Moscow. He appeared on Soviet television, smiling, glass in hand, praising the cause of socialism. For the CIA, it was like watching a ghost confess on live TV. Angleton was devastated. He had been Philby's closest friend, his confidant. The betrayal consumed him. He became obsessed with the idea that the CIA itself was infested with moles, and for the next 2 decades, his paranoia would paralyze the agency. This was the American angle of the Cambridge Five. Not just that Soviet spies had stolen secrets, but that they had infected the very psychology of American intelligence. Trust itself became the casualty. After the exposure of the Cambridge Five, the CIA turned inward. Every officer became a suspect. The agency launched brutal internal reviews, background checks, and psychological screenings. Files were reopened, agents interrogated, and careers destroyed by suspicion. Angleton's reign of paranoia created a ghost within the agency, one that whispered, "Who else is lying?" And yet, the irony was bitter. Despite all the internal witch hunts, the biggest damage had already been done years before. Soviet intelligence had enjoyed a golden age of insight, access to American military plans, nuclear research, and diplomatic strategy, all because 5 privileged men from Cambridge had played both sides and won. As declassified files later revealed, the American angle ran deeper than even the CIA knew at the time. Through the British connection, the Soviets had indirectly accessed Project Venona, America's secret effort to decrypt Soviet communications. They learned which ciphers were being broken and adjusted their codes before real damage could occur. Even US policy toward nuclear sharing and NATO defense plans had been subtly influenced. The KGB had a mirror in every Western conference room, and that mirror reflected back to Moscow through Philby's polished smile. For decades, the CIA tried to rebuild the shattered bridge of trust, but the scars of the Cambridge Five left an indelible mark on American intelligence philosophy. Never again would the United States fully trust an ally's word without verification. Behind the headlines and the politics, there was something even more tragic. The human cost of friendship turned to deception. James Jesus Angleton never truly recovered. Haunted by the betrayal, he began to see enemies everywhere. His obsession with internal moles crippled operations, alienated officers, and created a culture of suspicion that outlived him. And for the British spies who defected to Moscow, life wasn't the paradise they imagined. Burgess drank himself to death in a drab Soviet apartment. Maclean lived in isolation, forgotten by both sides. Philby died in 1988, reportedly lonely and disillusioned, a man who traded friendship for ideology and found emptiness instead. The Soviets had used them well, but in the end, they were tools, not heroes. The Cambridge Five forced the CIA to evolve. The agency doubled down on vetting, compartmentalization, and internal counterintelligence. It created a culture that valued skepticism over friendship. The scandal also reshaped global intelligence cooperation. The US began leading rather than following. Trust, but verify, a phrase that would later define Reagan's approach to the Soviets, was born from this. Betrayal. The Cambridge Five didn't just compromise secrets. They compromised belief that honor and class could protect nations from deceit, and that wound ran deep across the Atlantic. So here's the question. My friends, Were the Cambridge Five simply idealists trapped in the wrong ideology? Or were they master manipulators who rewrote the balance of the Cold War? Tell me in the comments. Who do you think paid the higher price? The traitors who defected or the Americans who trusted them? And if you want more untold stories from the shadow world, betrayals, double lives, and Cold War secrets that changed history, hit like, subscribe and ring the bell, because there are still files in the archives waiting to be opened, and stories the world was never meant to hear.